Ecology Essentials number 2. Today we will be discussing communities. So we'll start out by looking at the outline for today's podcast. First, we're going to talk generally about what a community is and then go into species interactions and biodiversity. For species interactions, we will discuss competition and with that niches, commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism. For biodiversity, we will look into keystone species and their effects on a community, trophic levels, and food chains and webs. So what is a community? Very generally, it's a set of populations that lives close enough together to interact with each other. If you need a rundown for populations, be sure to watch the first episode of Ecology Essentials. An example of a community is all the populations that live on the island of Tasmania, including populations like humans, plants, maybe even Tasmanian devils. One of the biggest things that biologists investigate when talking about communities is species interactions within a community. These interactions are also known as symbioses. One example of a species interaction is competition, where two or more species are competing for a resource, such as land or food. If one species outcompetes another species to the point of local extinction, that is known as a competitive exclusion. Another thing that can happen is resource partitioning, where different species divide up resources in some way to avoid conflict. This plays into something called a niche, which is simply the role a species has in the environment. The fundamental niche of a species is the ideal niche of the species. Think of it as a default. The realized niche of a species is the actual niche of a species in the community. Because of resource partitioning, species with the same fundamental niche can coexist in the same community. Competition between species is usually a net negative for both species, although it can lead to natural selection making one species better able to compete in the future. Another form of symbiosis is commensalism, which is a situation where one species benefits from the presence of another, but the other one is unaffected. These aren't extremely common compared with the other types of symbioses, but a good example is a spider building a web in a tree. The spider gets a place to place their web, which can maximize the amount of bugs that can be caught in it, and the tree is unaffected. Another example of species interaction is a mutualistic relationship in a community. In a mutualistic relationship, both species will benefit from the presence of the other in the community. There are tons of examples of mutualistic relationships in nature, such as between horses and humans. Humans provide the horses with food and shelter, while the horse provides the human with transportation and companionship. The final type of species interactions we will examine is parasitism. In a parasitic relationship, one species will benefit and one will be negatively affected, and there will be a host and a parasite. This is slightly different from predation, where usually one of the individuals in the relationship will be killed. In a parasitic relationship, the host will usually live. An example of this is the relationship between a human and a mosquito. The mosquito benefits because it gets a good meal from the human's blood, but the human is negatively affected because it just lost some blood and has a tiny itchy bump on their skin. Two of the types of parasites you should know are endoparasites, which live inside the host, and ectoparasites, which latch onto the outside of their hosts. So an example of an ectoparasite would be a mosquito. Moving on to biodiversity, we're going to take a look first at what a keystone species is. Basically, a keystone species is a species that exerts a very significant control on a community, even if it doesn't make up a large amount of the community's members. They add a lot of biodiversity to a community, and removing them can lead to biodiversity in a community dropping considerably, often devastating the community. Keystone species are often predators, which keep population numbers of other species in check and prevents one species that they prey on from dominating the others population-wise. Next up, we're going to discuss trophic levels, which are basically the feeding relationships between different species in a community. The bottom trophic level will be the primary producers like plants, and above them will be herbivores. Above them will be species that prey on them, and so on. The lower species is trophic level-wise, the more biomass they will take up. It is important to understand how energy is transferred between trophic levels. Each energy transfer between trophic levels will only transfer about 10% of that trophic level's energy up to the next trophic level. What this means is the higher a species is trophic level-wise, the more energy they will need to gather compared to lower levels. This makes perfect sense considering that the higher you go up, the lower your biomass will be in the community. Bouncing off of that, we have food chains and food webs. A food chain is basically what we just described with the trophic levels, where a food web is a bit more complex because it is a network of connected food chains, as seen in this diagram. Thank you for watching. In the next podcast, we will discuss ecological changes, and I hope this was helpful.